from ayah number 75, Surah Al-Kahf. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قال ألم أقل لك إنك لن تستطيع معي صبرا. قال إن سألتك عن شيء بعدها فلا تصاحبني قد بلغت من لدني عذرا. فانطلقا حتى إذا أتيا أهل قرية استطعما أهلها فأبوا أن يضيفوهما فوجدا فيها جدارا يريد أن ينقض فأقامه. قال لو شئت لاتخذت عليه أجرا. قال هذا فراق بيني وبينك سأنبئك بتأويل ما لم تستطع عليه صبرا. أما السفينة فكانت لمساكين يعملون في البحر فأردت أن أعيبها وكان وراءهم ملك يأخذ كل سفينة غصبا. وأما الغلام فكان أبواه مؤمنين فخشينا أن يرهقهما طغيانا وكفرا. فأردنا أن يبدلهما ربهما خيرا منه زكاة وأقرب رحما. وأما الجدار فكان لغلامين يتيمين في المدينة وكان تحته كنز لهما وكان أبوهما صالحا فأراد ربك أن يبلغا أشدهما ويستخرجا كنزهما رحمة من ربك وما فعلته عن أمري ذلك تأويل ما لم تسطع عليه صبرا. ويسألونك عن ذي القرنين قل سأتلو عليكم منه ذكرا. إنا مكنا له في الأرض وآتيناه من كل شيء سببا فأتبع سببا حتى إذا بلغ مغرب الشمس وجدها تغرب في عين حمئة ووجد عندها قوما قلنا يا ذا القرنين إما أن تعذب وإما أن تتخذ فيهم حسنا. قال أما من أظلم قال أما من ظلم فسوف نعذبه ثم يرد إلى ربه فيعذبه عذابا نكرا. وأما من آمن وعمل صالحا فله جزاء الحسنى وسنقول له من أمرنا يسرا. ثم أتبع سببا حتى إذا بلغ مطلع الشمس وجدها تطلع على قوم لم نجعل لهم من دونها سترا. كذلك وقد أحطنا بما لديه خبرا. ثم أتبع سببا حتى إذا بلغ بين السدين وجد من دونهما قوما لا يكادون يفقهون قولا. قالوا يا ذا القرنين إن يأجوج ومأجوج مفسدون في الأرض فهل نجعل لك خرجا على أن تجعل بيننا وبينهم سدا. قال ما مكني فيه ربي خير فأعينوني بقوة أجعل بينكم وبينهم ردما.
آتوني زبر الحديد حتى إذا ساوى بين الصدفين قال انفخوا حتى إذا جعله نارا قال آتوني أفرغ عليه قطرا فما استطاعوا أن يظهروه وما استطاعوا له نقبا قال هذا رحمة من ربي فإذا جاء وعد ربي جعله دكا وكان وعد ربي حقا وتركنا بعضهم يومئذ يموج في بعض ونفخ في الصور فجمعناهم جمعا وعرضنا جهنم يومئذ للكافرين عرضا الذين كانت أعينهم في غطاء عن ذكري وكانوا لا يستطيعون سمعا أفحسب الذين كفروا أن يتخذوا عبادي من دوني أولياء إنا أعتدنا جهنم للكافرين نزلا قل هل ننبئكم بالأخسرين أعمالا الذين ضل سعيهم في الحياة الدنيا وهم يحسبون أنهم يحسنون صنعا أولئك الذين كفروا بآيات ربهم ولقائه فحبطت أعمالهم فلا نقيم لهم يوم القيامة وزنا ذلك جزاؤهم جهنم بما كفروا واتخذوا آياتي ورسلي هزوا إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات كانت لهم جنات الفردوس نزلا خالدين فيها لا يبغون عنها حولا قل لو كان البحر مدادا لكلمات ربي لنفد البحر قبل أن تنفد كلمات ربي ولو جئنا بمثله مددا قل إنما أنا بشر مثلكم يوحى إلي أنما إلهكم إله واحد فمن كان يرجو لقاء ربه فليعمل عملا صالحا ولا يشرك بعبادة ربه أحدا بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم كافها يا عين صاد ذكر رحمة ربك عبده زكريا إذ نادى ربه نداء خفيا قال رب إني وهن العظم مني واشتعل الرأس شيبا ولم أكن بدعائك رب شقيا وإني خفت الموالي من ورائي وكانت امرأتي عاغرا فهب لي من لدنك وليا يرثني ويرث من آل يعقوب واجعله رب رضيا يا زكريا إنا نبشرك بغلام اسمه يحيى لم نجعل له من قبل سميا قال رب أنى يكون لي غلام وكانت امرأتي عاقرا وقد بلغت من الكبر عتيا قال كذلك قال ربك هو علي هين وقد خلقتك من قبل ولم تك شيئا قال رب اجعل لي آية قال آيتك ألا تكلم الناس 3 ليال سويا فخرج على قومه من المحراب فأوحى إليهم أن سبحوا بكرة وعشيا يا يحيى خذ الكتاب بقوة وآتيناه الحكم صبيا وحنانا من لدنا وزكاة وكان تقيا وبرا بوالديه ولم يكن جبارا عصيا وسلام عليه يوم ولد ويوم يموت ويوم يبعث حيا واذكر في الكتاب مريم إذ انتبذت من أهلها مكانا شرقيا فاتخذت من دونهم حجابا فأرسلنا إليها روحنا فتمثل لها بشرا سويا قالت إني أعوذ بالرحمن منك إن كنت تقيا قال إنما أنا رسول ربك لأهب لك غلاما زكيا قالت أنى يكون لي غلام ولم يمسسني بشر ولم أك بغيا قال كذلك قال ربك هو علي هين ولنجعله آية للناس ورحمة منا وكان أمرا مقضيا فحملته فانتبذت به مكانا قصيا فأجاءها المخاض إلى جذع النخلة قالت يا ليتني مت قبل هذا وكنت نسيا منسيا فناداها من تحتها ألا تحزني قد جعل ربك تحتك سريا وهزي إليك بجذع النخلة تساقط عليك رطبا جنيا صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Thanks a lot, Brother Muhammad, for your beautiful recitation. Jazakallah khair. So tonight's TQS title is Financial Literacy by Brother Ehsan Kashifpur, and we are gonna talk about how students can engage in smart financial decision making, ranging from investments to loan repayments. Also, Brother Ehsan is a May 2020 graduate with a Juris Doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and Masters of Business Administration from the Wharton School. He holds a Bachelor of Science from the University of Maryland's Smith School of Business and has years of experience as a management consultant at PricewaterhouseCoopers. He is also the National Director of Operation at the Muslim Interscholastic Tournament or MIST. Now I'd like to invite Brother Ehsan to start the session, and also we'll have a 15 minutes Q&A at the end of the session. So please direct message me your questions. Brother Ehsan.
Okay. Let me just get this going. All right. Let me just first begin by thanking the UPSA Network organizers for holding these series of important conversations with all of us and for inviting me to speak on this topic. I want to first acknowledge that financial literacy is a topic that a lot of us come at with different perspectives and different levels of expertise. And indeed, many of you are better versed than I am to speak on these issues. And so for that reason, my hope is that with this presentation, that everybody here is able to walk away with at least one new idea or concept that we haven't thought about before, so that this time we have together is beneficial for all of us, inshallah. I'll also add that I have embedded multiple opportunities for you to engage with the material that we're covering tonight. So please feel free to engage via the chat function when the time is appropriate as well. Okay. So for the agenda for tonight, we're going to be covering an introduction to money and what it's all about, We'll talk about budgeting, which is a very important concept for financial planning. We'll talk about student debt, investments, and I'll also introduce a few everyday tips and tricks that are important for all of us to be aware of. But first, what is money? So ever since humanity has kind of progressed from the barter system where I, as a corn farmer, would trade with you, somebody who grows wheat or barley, for your wheat or barley, and you would receive corn, humanity has moved towards using currency as a form of money to facilitate our everyday transactions. And we've seen over the history of humanity many different forms of currency being used. So things such as seashells, precious metals, including gold, and even paper have all been used as money at some point in time. But today's money, the US dollar or the Iranian rial, which we're familiar with, has no intrinsic value in itself. And so where does this currency get its value from? Well, it's from two places. The first is that the government who's printing these currencies tell us that they have value. And the second is that we expect other people will value the currency at a certain value as well. But it's important to understand that the value of the currency that we hold actually decreases over time. And this is a phenomena which is known as inflation. Inflation does not mean that a dollar is no longer worth a dollar at some point in the future, that it's going to be worth something like 50 cents or something like that. But instead what this means is that the dollar is no longer able to buy you what it was once able to. And so to illustrate this concept, we'll take a look at the example of a cup of coffee and the cost of it over time. In the year 1970, the cost of a cup of coffee was just 25 cents. Over the past 5 decades, the cost has gone up to $1.59. And so what this means is that it now costs more than 6 times as much money to buy the same product, in this case, a cup of coffee. But this is kind of universal. We see this rising prices for all sorts of products that we purchase every day. And so why does inflation matter? Well, the fact that money loses its value over time has a number of important implications for us as financial planners. I want to highlight just a couple of these for today. The first is that when we are evaluating financial or investment decisions, we should value money sooner more than we value money later. So for example, if I were to offer to give you $100 today or $100 in a year from now, everybody should prefer to receive the $100 today since it has greater value. And second, how we hold our money also matters. So our money should always be stored in a way that is increasing in amount, because if it's not increasing in amount, then it's actually decreasing in its value. Okay, so that brings us to our pop quiz number 1. Inflation suggests that holding your money as cash is a good idea because its value goes up over time, good idea because it stimulates the economy, bad idea because its value goes down over time, or D, bad idea because it dampens the economy. So I'll just wait a second for you to think about this question. If you'd like, you can share your response in the chat as well. All right, so the answer here is C. It's a bad idea. Holding your money as cash is bad because its value goes down over time, which is what inflation tells us. And so this leads us to think about what are some better alternative ways for us to hold our money. Well, at a minimum, we should store our money in a savings account where there is at least some return on that money every year, even though the amount that it will increase is actually still going to be below the inflation rate. But for longer term investments, we're really going to want to think about bonds and stocks, which we'll talk more about shortly in the investment section. All right, so our next topic is budgeting. Budgeting means planning your finances, and it's something that's absolutely essential for your financial health. There are basic things that everybody should be keeping close track of on a monthly basis, and these include your revenues, or the money you have coming in, and your expenses, or the money that's going out. You should include all of your sources of revenues and all of the expenses that you anticipate or project paying in every month. I've included a few examples here on this slide. So, we'll say for this person in June next month, they're expecting to get wages, some investment income, government benefits, or gifts and allowances. And they're also going to have some expenses. So they're going to have their mortgage or their rent. They'll have utility expenses, and they're students, so they're paying tuition. And they have a slush fund. And the slush fund is what's used for irregular expenses. So things that might fall into this category include entertainment expenses, such as going to the movie theaters or going out to restaurants, or also small purchases. So things like you need a new pair of shoes next month. So let's put some dollars on these, and we'll say that this person has $1,000 that they're receiving in wages, or their salary. They have investment income of $500 next month, and they're going to receive a $20 gift. So this brings their total revenues to $1,520. Meanwhile, as for their expenses, they pay $800 in rent, $200 in utilities. They make $150 monthly payments on tuition, and their slush fund has $200 in it for irregular expenses. So this brings the total expenses to $1,350. Now, as you can see, the total revenues for next month are going to exceed the total expenses by $170. And so what is the role of that $170? Should we find some way to spend that in the next month since we're going to have more revenue than expenses? Of course not. This is the difference between our revenues and expenses in a given month is precisely where the role of saving or borrowing come in. And so for next month, because our revenues exceed our expenses, we're going to save that $170. But what if instead you were currently unemployed? You're a full-time student, you don't have a job, and you're not making that $1,000 a month in wages anymore. Well, in this situation, as you can see, our expenses are exceeding our revenues by $830. And so in this situation, we're not going to want to necessarily scale down our lifestyle entirely down to the $520 that we're receiving in that month or expecting to receive in that month. This is the role of borrowing in this situation, that we're going to want to borrow money to finance our expenses in this month because our expenses exceed our revenues. Borrowing and saving play a very important role in our financial planning. In general, those who overspend currently now and put off saving for retirement often have to work longer or reduce their standard of living when they are in retirement. And those who oversave now to enjoy a better lifestyle once they're older or retired will live a more and unnecessarily frugal lifestyle now. So in each of these cases, your overall standard of living is actually less than optimal. Instead, our financial planning goal should be to smoothen our quality of life over our lifetimes. And we accomplish this by spreading out our spending levels. Essentially, we want to have a consistent level of spending, more or less, over the course of our adult lifetimes. This graph here illustrates the typical person's life in terms of their income. The curve shows our income level, which, as you can see, increases over our lifetimes until it reaches its peak, and then it starts dropping back down. We want to take that entire lifetime earnings that we're expecting and spread out our spending in a more level manner, as you can see the straight consumption line, so that we maintain an optimal lifestyle over our lifetimes. And so what this is going to mean is that when we're young and we're students, we are going to be in quote unquote living beyond our means. But then when we're in our working ages and we're making the most income that we do in our lives, you're going to be saving a lot of the money that you're making at that time and using that to spend it before, which you did as a student, but then in the future as well, once you're retired and no longer working. So you may be wondering why it's our goal to smoothen our consumption over our lifetimes. And so I'm going to illustrate by just one basic example. Let's look at Jafar's earnings over his lifetime. When he's 25, Jafar makes $30,000 per year. When he's 55, Jafar makes $150,000 per year. So in this situation, if I offered to give Jafar $10,000 at any point in his life, is he going to prefer to have that money when he's 25 or when he's 55? Well, of course, he's going to prefer it when he's 25, since that $10,000 would go a longer way for him then than it would when he's 55 and already has a beautiful home, a car, and he eats kebab kubida for dinner every night. Great. So now we understand what the role of a budget is and why it's important. And we also know what our goals for budgeting are. Now, how do you actually make a budget in practice? Well, you can make a really simple yet effective budget in Microsoft Excel. I'm not going to go through this now, but feel free to Google and search for free templates. There are a lot of great ones out there for budgets that you can use and customize to fit your needs. And as we discussed, the most important thing is to make sure you're keeping track of all of your projected revenues, expenses for each month. But I also want to introduce a free online service called Mint. Mint is by Intuit. It's the same company that runs TurboTax, which is used for income tax returns at the end of the year. With Mint, you can link all of your bank accounts, credit cards, and other financial accounts that you may have, and Mint will automatically track your income and spending, and it even categorizes your expenses, so you can better understand how you are spending your money each month. And the more information you have on how you're spending your money, the better you can forecast in the future as well. All right, that brings us to pop quiz number 2. How can we smooth our consumption over our lifetimes? A, borrowing when we are young. B, saving for when we are older. C, setting monthly budgets to plan our spending in advance. Or D, all of the above. I'll wait just a second if you want to think about this and if you'd like to share your answers in the chat.
So far, we have 1 vote for C.
For C?
Yep, so far.
Yep, so C is definitely important. So the answer here is actually D. We need to do all of the above in order to smooth our consumption over our lifetime. C is critical because without proper budgeting, we won't know how much money we need to borrow or to save at any point in our lifetimes. But as we discussed, you can actually smoothen your consumption in practice by saving during those high earning years. And when you are younger, you should be borrowing against those future savings by taking out student loans or mortgages, etc. And once you're retired, you should spend from the savings that you had previously amassed in your working years. Okay, so that brings us to our next topic, student debt. So I'm going to give an introduction to student debt and financial aid in general for students. And then we'll talk about strategies and things to keep in mind for repaying this debt. So first, let's take a look at the types of financial aid that we can receive as students. The most common things that we hear about are grants, scholarships, and student loans. We'll talk about the student loans in a little bit more detail in a second. I want to note that there's a lot of options available to you, and it's really important that you have a conversation with your school's financial aid office to see what options are available for you so that you can take advantage of all of them. It's unfortunately impossible to go through everything that might be available and relevant to your particular circumstances. So be sure to have that conversation. But first, let's talk about scholarships and grants. So scholarships and grants could be either need-based or merit-based. So need-based grants essentially take a look at how much money you or your parents or your family make in the past 3, 5, however many years. And the school essentially comes up with an assessment of how much it's expected that you pay or your family pays towards your tuition. And some schools may help cover some of the remaining costs through need-based grants or scholarships. Then there's also merit-based scholarships, which can take many different forms, but they look at your, for example, your academic history. They'll take a look at if you're an athlete of some kind. There's many different types of ways you might receive a merit-based scholarship or grant. But in essence, both of these work the same way, and that's why they're on the same slide here. Scholarships and grants do not need to be repaid. This is the key difference between these and loans. Now, I want to caveat that by saying scholarships and grants don't need to be repaid as long as you do meet their requirements, right? So a lot of these might require that you graduate, or maybe that you graduate within a certain number of years. If you decide that you want to drop out of school, well, you're going to have to repay those scholarships or grants. So I just want to add that caveat that as long as you're meeting the terms, they don't have to be repaid. There's a number of different sources from which you might receive scholarships and grants. The federal and state governments provide some of their own. Many of the times these go through your university. So when you're applying to school, the school might be handling this. But other times you want to apply directly on websites. So for example, if you live in California, you can look at the website for California higher education and take a look at what scholarships or grants might be available for students in California. But no matter where you live, you can look at the ones that are available by the federal government. Universities often have their own scholarships or grants as well that they provide to students, both need-based as well as merit-based ones. And there's also private organizations. Now, the private organizations are the hardest ones to actually learn about. And so it's important to spend the time and do your research and try to find these scholarships and grants. They're oftentimes hiding on, a company or a nonprofit organization's website. And so a lot of times as students, we don't do the legwork to try to find these and uncover these, but they do exist. A lot of organizations do have scholarships or grants that you can apply for and receive. So let's talk about student loans, and first we'll talk about federal student loans. So depending on where you are in your academic career, there are going to be different federal student loans available to you. So first, let's take a look at undergraduate students. Undergraduate students have access to 3 types of federal student loans. The first is the direct subsidized loan. The second is the direct unsubsidized loan. These two sound very similar, and they're both the Stafford loans. Some people call them Stafford loans. And the key difference here is that one is subsidized and the other one is unsubsidized. And so what is subsidized about the direct subsidized loans? Well, these actually don't accrue any interest when you are in school at least half time. They don't accrue interest for 6 months after you leave or graduate from your undergraduate institution. And there's also periods of deferment. For example, I know that if you're in grad school, for example, you can defer your payments. And during these instances, subsidized loans don't accrue interest. So this is the key distinguisher between the subsidized loans and the unsubsidized loans. Unsubsidized loans actually accrue interest at all times from the moment that you get the disbursement from your school. So even if you're a first year in a 3-year grad program or a 4-year grad program, the unsubsidized loans are accruing interest. The last loan is the direct plus loan, and direct plus loans are for undergraduate students are actually only available to your parents if you're claimed as a dependent. So you as a student cannot yourself take out a direct plus loan. For graduate and professional students, the key difference between them and the undergrads is that there is no subsidized loan. The federal government only provides subsidized loans for undergraduate students. And so your choices are between the direct unsubsidized loans and the direct plus loans, which are very similar to one another. The only difference between these is the actual interest rates. So let's take a look at the interest rates. For undergraduate students, they receive a preferential interest rate as compared to grad and professional students. The Stafford loans, both subsidized and unsubsidized, accrue interest at 4.53%. These are the latest numbers. I'm just using these as illustrative purposes so you can see the differences, not necessarily the actual values. And so that number is pretty low, especially when you compare it to the direct plus loan, which is over 7%. For grad students, so the difference between the unsubsidized loans and the direct plus loans is, again, just the interest rate, and there's a 1% difference there. And so this might seem obvious, but you want to be sure that when you are taking out these loans, that you're comparing the different interest rates that are available and taking the ones that are most favorable first to cover your needs. And only then, if you still need additional loans, you start thinking about the ones that have higher interest rates. And especially if you're an undergraduate student now, direct subsidized loans are a very nice opportunity for you to borrow money and not have to repay it for 4 years if you're an undergrad. And it only accrues interest once you graduate and after 6 months then. The one thing I'll note about these federal student loans is that you should also take a look at the origination fees. And so origination fees essentially are an amount that you pay on the entire loan that you take out. So if I take out a $100,000 loan, I might be asked to pay a 1% origination fee. And so that $1,000 is going to come out immediately from the amount that I get. And so that's something to think about when you are considering taking loans out in situations where maybe they're not even necessary. Now, repayment is deferred until you leave school or graduate for these federal student loans. That's something that sets these apart from the private ones, which we'll talk about in a second. Whereas with private loans, you may be asked to pay for your loan even while you still are in school, and amounts are going to become due. The other difference here is that assistance programs may be available if you're having trouble repaying. So the federal government has opportunities for you to lower your monthly payments while extending the length of the duration of the loan if you're having trouble repaying, and that might be something that will be tied to your income. So these are opportunities that are available with federal student loans that make them more preferable to private ones. Well, let's talk about private student loans as well. So private student loans are loans that are by actual private banks. So wherever you're holding your money in a checking or savings account, most likely also offers loans, including student loans. Generally, these student loans by private banks and private organizations are going to be more expensive than the federal loans we talked about. And so for illustrative purposes, currently, private student loans interest rates can range somewhere from 4.5% all the way to 15%. And the terms for these student loans can vary a lot, depending on the bank and depending on the loan that you're negotiating. Some may require repayment while you're in school, as we discussed, and other ones may even have a variable interest rate. So while we saw with the federal student loans, for example, a 6% interest rate for the unsubsidized loan is going to be the same for the entire duration of your loan, whereas with private student loans, a variable interest rate may give you, for example, a 5% rate for the first few years, but then say in 4 years, it's going to jump up to 10%. And so the key thing to keep in mind here is that when you're looking at private student loans, these are not going to be kind of one size fits all like the federal loans that are available to all students. All right, so borrowing and repayment. As we saw earlier in the budgeting section, we should always be forecasting how much money we are short in covering our expenses for each month. This is especially important for students. And you should be doing this similar projection for months or maybe even years in advance. So if you're just starting, for example, your graduate school, let's say it's a 2-year program, you can come up with an Excel sheet that is going to keep track of how much money you need to sustain yourself and pay for your expenses over the course of those 2 years. And that way you can figure out how much money you are going to be short from what you need to cover your expenses. And so this is going to help you by only borrowing the amount that you actually need so that you're not paying additional interest or origination fees on loans that you don't need. Well, why is this important? It's important because student loan rates are actually pretty high. Even with the lowest possible rate, right? The direct subsidized loan is over 4.4%, something like 4.53%. And this rate is generally higher than interest rates on home mortgages. So therefore, you have to keep in mind that taking out this money isn't free, it comes at a cost. And when you're thinking about repayment, it usually makes sense to pay off your student loans sooner than you would even other debts that you have because of their high interest rates. And essentially, once you are at that point and you can start paying off your debts, you're going to want to consider the interest rates that each of these loans have and start by paying off the ones that are higher sooner. The last thing I want to mention here is that you should consider consolidating and refinancing your loans. Consolidating your loans essentially says, for example, let's say you're a grad student and you took out both unsubsidized loans as well as grad plus loans. Once you're done with school, you can kind of combine these all into one loan, and so it's just easier to organize and manage. Refinancing means actually taking out a new loan to cover the cost of the old ones that you had. Now, why might this be beneficial? Refinancing your student loans may be beneficial because the federal government or even private banks are giving you loans at standardized rates, and they're kind of using information from students as a whole. But let's say, for example, you've secured a job after you graduate from grad school or undergrad, and you're going to be making, let's say, $60,000 a year or $70,000 a year. Well, once you have that piece of information, you don't carry the same amount of risk as other students. And so what you can do is you can go to refinancers. So these are going to be similar banks. And you're going to provide that additional information and say, hey, I have this job that's going to pay me $70,000 a year. I have a good credit score. And for all of these reasons, you may be entitled to a better interest rate later than you were earlier. And this is particularly relevant for the federal loans, which are just standardized rates for everybody. And so I'll just give an example of one organization, SoFi. They refinance loans. They've done several $1 billion worth of student loans. They've refinanced them for students. Most people are pretty happy with them. So this is one thing that you might want to look at and consider is refinancing your student loans once you are done with school and have a job lined up. All right, no pop quiz for student debt, but we'll talk more about this in a second. But for now, let's jump to investments. Introduction to investments. We talked extensively about the need to save money, and that was primarily for two reasons. The first was we need to save money so that we can use it when we have less income. We also need to save money so that it makes up for some of the value lost due to inflation. Now, what if we were able to not only save money for later, but actually put our savings to work to make more money? Well, this is precisely the role of investments. There are two key ideas that are essential for us to understand any investment decision. The first is annual return, or how much money will I make on this investment per year? So it's important to understand that not every investment makes the same amount of money every year. In fact, some investments may even require you to spend money at first, only to hope to make some in the future. But for any investment decision, we're going to want to know and to compare how much money you will make each year on average. The second factor is risk. How certain are we that we are actually going to achieve that level of return? Different investments have different amounts of risk. It's also important to recognize that risk doesn't necessarily mean, well, am I going to make $100 or $200 on this investment? Some investments may even run the risk of losing money over time as well, and that's something that we're going to want to keep in mind. So we'll talk about both of these shortly, but for now, I just want to make the point that annual return and risk go hand in hand. Generally speaking, the greater the annual return expected, the greater the risk. So in particular, what I mean is that there is a trade-off between risk and reward. The investments with greater expected return are also the ones that generally carry higher amounts of risk. Okay, so now that we have our framework, we can start thinking about the different investment instruments. We've already discussed cash savings, and we know that a bank savings account provides very low return, typically even less than inflation, but carries very low risk as well. So for tonight, we'll introduce two more instruments: government bonds and stocks. Government bonds are an investment instrument by which you are, in essence, lending money to the government through which you're buying a bond. So governments around the world, the state and local governments, as well as the federal government in the United States, all may be selling government bonds. And these offer a fixed, generally pretty low return of around 2 to 3% per year. But what's critical about these is that they are very low risk, and that's because they are backed by the government. And so the more stable a government, the lower amount of risk, and probably the lower return that they're going to pay on these bonds. And the only time where you wouldn't get paid back is if that government defaulted on their debt, essentially if the government went bankrupt. Now, it's important to know that this is something that can happen. There have been states and even cities in the United States that have declared bankruptcy in the past. But generally, it's considered that the U.S. government bonds are the safest investments that one can make. So the other instrument we talked about are stocks. Investing in a stock is you purchasing a fraction of a company's shares. And by owning a stock, this entitles you to a portion of the company's profits. The way that this normally looks is that if the company is doing well, the value of your stock is going to go up. And if the company does poorly, then the value of your stock goes down. It's important to know that some stocks are safer, such as Amazon, Google, or Walmart, the bigger players, whereas some stocks are riskier, so startup companies that it's not clear if they're going to succeed or not, or pharmaceutical companies that invested several $1 million in a new drug that may not work. Portfolio diversification is a process by which we allocate money to various financial instruments, industries, and other investment categories. And so, for example, you'll put some of your money in, say, technology companies, and some of your money in oil companies, and some of your money in pharmaceutical companies. By doing so, what we can achieve is keeping a high expected return while reducing our risk. And the reason that this happens is because it's much less likely that all of your investments across industries and sectors are going to crash at once. So some examples of mechanisms by which one can diversify their portfolio in kind of standardized ways is by buying ETFs or exchange traded funds, mutual funds, or hedge funds, which can include combinations of stocks as well as government bonds and other short-term investments. So I want to share this chart to demonstrate how the balance of investments in your portfolio affects annual return and risk. So on this chart, as you go from left to right, from conservative to aggressive growth, the shares of stocks increases, while the share of bonds and other short-term, low-risk investments decreases. Now, as you can see from the rows below, the more stocks you own, the more you go to the right, the greater the possible upside or best annual return you could achieve, but also the lower the possible downside or the worst annual return you can achieve. Over a 20-year period, however, the best case scenario under the aggressive investments is about 16.5% per year, while its worst case scenario, 2.66%, is just barely lower than the worst case scenario under a conservative portfolio. And so this is the beauty of diversification at play. Now, how does all of this tie into retirement accounts? So 401ks and IRAs are simply diversified portfolios of investments. Your 401k or IRA account is allocating your investments into a variety of funds, including mutual funds and sector funds. This is why when the stock market collapses, such as in the 2008 to 2010 global recession, or right now with the coronavirus pandemic, many people's retirement funds are getting entirely wiped out, even though they are diversified portfolios, because the stock market across industries, across sectors has collapsed. With retirement accounts, these funds are usually optimized to a specific end year. So for example, let's say I'm 20 years now and I'm going to retire when I'm 60. So your retirement account is going to be optimized for that 40-year period once you hit 60 years old and you want to start pulling money out. What I mean by it being optimized is that as you get closer to your retirement date, the investments that you hold will gradually become more conservative. So in practice, what this means is that when you're younger, when you're in your 20s and 30s, you're going to be holding on to a lot of stock investments. But as you get older, you're going to be holding on to more bonds and less stocks. Okay, so let's talk about some of the key factors and characteristics of 401ks and IRAs. What's so special about these retirement accounts? Well, the key here is that these accounts allow you to defer taxes from when you make the contributions to when you want to withdraw from your account. Usually this is preferable because let's say, you're 30 years now and you're making a lot of money. Well, you're going to be paying taxes at a higher tax bracket, which means you're paying more taxes as a percentage. But once you're older and you're retired and you're pulling the money out, you're not going to have as much income at that time, most likely. And in that situation, it's to your advantage to delay paying taxes since you're going to pay less when you take out the money in retirement. I also want to note that 401ks are open through your employer. And depending on your job, your employer may even offer to match contributions that you make into your 401k to a certain limit. If they do, this is a great thing to take advantage of. It's one of the benefits of your job. And by putting money into your 401k, your employer will put some money into there as well for you. I'll also say that these retirement accounts usually have early withdrawal penalties. So they're designed to be used solely for retirement saving. But if you really needed to, you could withdraw funds early at a cost. Okay, before we move on from retirement accounts, you may have also heard about Roth 401ks or Roth IRAs. These are essentially identical accounts. The key difference is that rather than paying taxes when you take money out in retirement, you pay the taxes before you put money in now while you're working. And the advantage here might be, let's say you have a lot of investments and you're going to be making a lot of money in the future, even during retirement. Well, you can pay the taxes now on the money you're putting into your retirement accounts. And once you want to take money out, it's going to be tax-free. And the key thing to know here is that even the gains on your investment during the 20, 30 years that they've been invested in stocks and bonds, those aren't going to be taxed either. So that's the key difference between normal 401ks and IRAs as compared to Roth 401ks and IRAs. All right, that brings us to pop quiz number 3. Which of the following is the best investment option? A savings account paying 0.5% return per year, a government bond paying 2% return per year, a stock where you expect a 6% return per year, or a student loan, which is accruing 5.5% interest per year. I know we just covered a lot between the student debt and the investment section, so I'll wait a second for you to think about this question and share your answers in the chat.
So far, we got one answer for C and one answer for D.
All right, so those are both great answers. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit just to kind of tie things together. The answer here is actually D. And the reason why the answer is D is because there's something missing from this question, which isn't explicitly there, and that's the risk. We talked about how annual return and risk generally go hand in hand, and we talked about the risk involved with savings accounts, government bonds versus stocks. The reason why you should take your money in this situation and invest it by paying down your student debt is the following. For a savings account, there's very low risk. For a government bond, the risk is also very low. With a stock, that has high risk. The chances of you getting that actual 6% return per year is actually pretty low. The reason why is because it's more likely that you're going to make something either more or less than that 6% on that stock. But with a student loan, there's actually no risk involved. Why is there no risk involved? Well, you're paying interest at 5.5% per year. If you put your quote unquote investment money into your student loan, well, if I put $100 in, that's $100 that I'm not paying 5.5% in the following year or the next year or the year after that. And being guaranteed a 5.5% per year return without risk is almost going to be the no-brain decision for most people. But that's particularly true for a situation like the hypothetical example we have on the slide. All right, so that brings us to our last topic, everyday tips and tricks. So these are some key things that I think is really important for everybody to be aware of, so I just want to share these with all of you as well. The first thing we're going to talk about is your FICO credit score. A credit score is a 3-digit number that essentially represents your credit worthiness. Or in other words, it's a measure of how risky of an investment you are. The higher your credit score, the less risky you are. And as we have seen in the previous slides, and we have all mastered by now, is that the less risky an investment is, so in this case, the higher your credit score, the less return or interest is going to be demanded of you. So by having a high credit score, when you go to take out private student loans or mortgages or borrow money in other ways, they're going to charge you a lower interest rate since you're low risk. It's absolutely essential to you and your financial well-being that you do everything you can to maintain the highest credit score, because this can go a long way not only for taking loans, but in some situations, even applying for certain jobs. Okay, so some ways that you can keep your score up. I'm just highlighting a few of the key ones here. One, you can apply for credit only when it's needed. The reason why this helps build your credit is because the more credit you already have extended to you, so if you already have 5 credit cards, getting a 6th one is going to hurt your credit score because you already have a lot of money that you have access to. The second is keeping your balances low. If you have 1 credit card for a $1,000 credit limit, but you're constantly running over $900 on it, that makes you more risky since it looks like you're using all of the credit that is extended to you. So future banks who want to lend money to you are going to demand higher interest rates. And finally, you want to pay your bills on time. This includes your regular utility or cell phone bills, but it also includes tickets or other citations you may have, like parking tickets or if you use EasyPass. These can all potentially damage your credit score if and when they get sent to collection agencies. So you want to be sure to pay all of those. Okay, so the next step is credit cards. I want to dedicate a slide to credit cards, and the reason why is because they're an instrument that everybody should be using for their everyday spending, and we're going to talk about why that is. By using a credit card, you're able to protect yourself against unauthorized transactions. You're able to build credit, you can pay for your purchases later, and you can gain rewards such as cash back. Now, some credit cards are different than others, and some may have annual fees. So for example, there are American Express credit cards that may have $500 annual fees that you must pay. But there are also plenty of options without annual fees. Generally, these cards, you can pick the one that makes most sense for you. But I did want to share an example for people that this might be helpful for, the Capital One Sabre One Rewards card. It has a $0 annual fee. By signing up and spending a certain amount of money on it, you can get a $150 cash bonus. You receive 1 to 3% cash back on all of your purchases, and there's no foreign transaction fees. So you can take it with you when you're visiting other countries or traveling and use this to make your purchases abroad as well. Now, I want to make the point that you should only be spending the money that you have actually budgeted. And so we saw the budgets before, and we talked about how it's important that we forecast our expenses for future months. We should only be using our credit cards to pay for those. Why is that? Well, credit cards are not a good mechanism for using money that you don't currently have, or as we called it before, borrowing against future earnings. And the reason why is because they have very high interest rates that will be charged if you don't pay off your credit card balance in full every month. So again, credit cards are not a vehicle for spending money you don't have. Okay, so the next tip is the annual credit report. So the annual credit report doesn't show your actual credit score, the 3-digit number we talked about that assesses your riskiness, but it does show all of your credit accounts and whether they are adversely affecting your credit score. So it's important that you take a look at your credit report to see what it is that's affecting your credit score. If there are credit card accounts or other credit accounts that are past due and have hurt your credit score. And it's also important that you take a look at these so that you can correct any information that's inaccurate. Now, once per year, you have access to your credit reports for free. There are 3 credit report agencies, TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian. All of these are required by law to give you access once per year. So you can go to www.annualcreditreport.com once a year and check out all 3 credit reports. And I highly advise that everybody does that. All right, and that brings us to pop quiz number 4. Spending via credit card is better than by debit card or cash because it offers greater protection in the event of loss or theft. It builds your credit score. It offers rewards such as cash back. And because you are financially responsible and will pay your bill on time, or E, all of the above. All right, so the answer here is, as
yeah,
you
we
all
got
know,
2
E.
answers for E. Yeah, sorry.
There we go. The answer is E, all of the above. Using credit cards provides all the benefits that are listed here in A through C, offers better protection in the event of loss or theft, builds your credit score, and it offers rewards such as cash back, but only in the event that you're actually responsible and you're going to pay your bill on time. Otherwise, you're going to get charged really high interest rates. All right, so that is the conclusion of my presentation. I think I may have gone over, but I'm not sure. But I want to, again, thank the organizers of AppSet Network for putting on these presentations, and to all of you for bearing with me through this presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions if there is time remaining.
Thanks a lot, Brother Islam, for your great presentation. That was very informative and insightful. Jazakallah khair, inshallah. We got 2 questions so far. So it would be great if we can have some short answers for them. So the first one is, what do you think about investing in the stock market during this pandemic and this specific time?
That's a very interesting and big question that a lot of people are facing now. Before I answer, I just want to let everybody know, I think this is clear, but I'm not an investment professional. So none of this is actual advice that I suggest you go and act upon. So if you go and invest tomorrow and you lose a lot of money, don't come blame me for it. This is just my thoughts and things that I want to share with you. And so the stock market right now is actually, as everybody knows, has crashed a lot recently. It kind of rebounded from its initial drop, but it has gone up a little bit. But I think the most important thing to note right now with the stock market is there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. A lot of people are talking now in the public health realms about a second wave of coronavirus. It's not clear when the economies are going to reopen. And most importantly, it's not clear how consumers, you and I, are going to react, even once the economy does, quote unquote, open. Are people going to travel like they did before? Are people going to commute to work, or is everybody going to be telecommuting in the future going forward? There's a lot of questions about what the future is going to look like, and this impacts the value of the companies. And as we talked about, once companies do well, stocks go up, and once they're doing poorly, stocks go down. And so while you might see that right now, a lot of stocks are lower than they generally were, we don't know where they're going next. So it's not fair to say that, well, they're lower now and generally they've been pretty high. So we can assume that, for example, oil and gas or airline stocks are going to go back up. In fact, when you take a look at what real investment professionals and people who do this for a living are doing, Warren Buffett, for example, has been selling a lot of stocks recently because he is not he's not confident that the economy is going to rebound the way that he had once thought it would. And so he's, for example, just this past week, sold his share in airline companies. And for those who don't know, Warren Buffett is probably one of the world's premier investors. He's been doing this forever. He owned Berkshire Hathaway, and he's one of the richest people in the world from investing. And so what Warren Buffett does is a big indicator of where the economy is going. And it seems like there's a lot of uncertainty now. Now, that being said, as we talked about earlier, stocks are inherently a risky asset and they're a risky investment. And so if you want to try your hand at it and give it a shot, there's no necessarily harm in doing that. I wouldn't recommend putting your lifetime savings into stocks right now, though, because it's really unclear and there's a lot of uncertainty. But some people for example, are investing in pharmaceutical companies or biopharm companies who are working on cures for COVID. And so if you happen to invest in one of those and they come out with the vaccine, you'll be in good shape. But who knows what that is? I don't know who that is, and nobody else does. Otherwise, they would take advantage of that opportunity themselves.
Great, thanks a lot for your explanation. We got one more question that what are dividends?
What are dividends? That's a good question. Okay, so we didn't talk about dividends, and the reason why is because for most people, they're not necessarily too relevant. And here's why. So companies who make a profit, right? So we'll take two examples. We'll look at, so I'm in Philadelphia. We have a company called Pico. It's the Philadelphia Energy Company. They're the ones who provide electricity to homes in Philadelphia. Let's take a look at those, and then we'll take a look at Amazon. But let's say Amazon 10 years ago, okay? So Pico has been providing electricity to people in Philadelphia for decades. And they've been doing it pretty consistently. People use electricity, and they pay Pico money for that electricity. Prices don't change too much, and Pico's profits don't change too much. But Pico does make a profit. So let's say Pico was publicly traded and you buy a stock in Pico. Well, is that value of Pico's stock going to go up or down a lot? Probably not, because they've been pretty consistent in what they're doing. And so a company like that, that's pretty consistent, very stable, very mature, might pay dividends to its shareholders. So what this means is that when Pico makes a profit, what they do with that profit is they give it off to their shareholders, because as a shareholder, we talked about you're entitled to a part of the profits of the company. And so you will receive a dividend, let's say once a quarter or once a year for $5 or $10 or something like that. So this might be something that's interesting for people who are looking for a regular return on their investment. You want to know for sure you're going to receive $5 a month for the next 30 years or something like that through your investment. So that's where a dividend might come in. Now, where you don't see dividends is with high growth companies. So Amazon, we talked about 10 years ago, was in a huge growth stage. Well, Amazon, even if it was making a profit back then, wouldn't want to give its money out, its profits out to its shareholders. What it would rather do is reinvest those profits in itself as a company so it can continue to grow more. That's because it's not a public utility and there is room for Amazon to grow. So that's the difference between high growth companies and low growth or mature companies. And generally, you're going to see those dividends with the low growth ones.
Thanks a lot. And the last question is, how do you compare real estate investment vs stocks?
Yeah, that's a good question. So on our little graph that we had from risk and reward, real estate falls somewhere between corporate bonds, which were low risk and low return, and between that and stocks, which are high risk and high return. Real estate's generally a little bit more stable than stocks. But as we saw, just 10 years ago, that's not necessarily always true, and real estate can also lose its value a lot. Less frequently do we see real estate gaining its value a lot. So generally, you're seeing returns that are somewhere between the corporate bonds and stocks. Now, why didn't we talk about real estate? Well, real estate isn't generally one of the ways that people usually invest their money. There's a number of reasons for this. I'm not a real estate investment expert, so I'm not going to get into it in detail, but the returns aren't necessarily that high, as you saw from the graphs before. And they cost a lot of capital to put in at the same time as well, so that you can invest in real estate. So the real estate is something that I would say in general, we've seen our older generation to do a lot, is invest in real estate. But I'm not making any advice now, but I don't think it's one of the best ways to invest your money in general, and it's not something that we see usually either. And so most people who are investing their money for the future, for retirement, you're going to look at some combination of bonds and stocks.
Thanks a lot for your answers, Brother Ehsan. Also, thanks a lot for joining us for tonight and for your great presentation. Jazakallah khair, inshallah. Just as a quick notice, we won't have any program from tomorrow until Saturday, May 16th, and the next program would be on Sunday, May 17th. And for concluding the session, I'd like to invite Brother Muhammad Jawad for reciting Dua Faraj for us, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Brother Murtaza, and Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma kun waliyak al-Hujjata ibn al-Hasan. Salawatuka alayhi وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل الساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. صلوات.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Thanks a lot, Brother Muhammad Jawad. Also, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We'll see you, inshallah, all on Sunday, May 17th. And inshallah, everyone has a great night. Assalamu alaikum.